Hello, this is another episode of Break the Silence, brought to you by Aid to the Church in Need, the charity which supports persecuted and other suffering Christians in 140 countries around the world. Today our topic is India, and I'm John Pontifex, the Head of Press and Public Affairs for Aid to the Church in Need UK, and to discuss this important area of Aid to the Church in Need's concerns, I have with me Dr. John Newton, who is the Research and Communications Manager for Aid to the Church in Need UK. And John has recently been out to India to see for himself the work of the charity. And my first question to John, if I may, is to ask what particular parts of India did you travel to?
Well, mostly I was in the northeast, in Jharkhand state. We flew into Ranchi, and then we were picked up at the airport by the Bishop of Dalton Ganj, Bishop Theo, who made us very welcome indeed. I have never been greeted at an airport before by a bishop with a garland to place around my neck, but that's the traditional way of welcoming guests in India. And to be literally walk out of the terminal and have this warm welcome by this small party of the bishop and a couple of priests, it really made a very positive impression. And then we journeyed on for about an hour or so to get to Dalton Ganj, where we stayed at the pastoral centre. Right. And from there on, we went out to the far-flung parishes in the rural wilds, in the jungles, and in other places which rarely, if ever, see a bishop. And only see a priest possibly on a monthly basis or every few weeks. Right. And you stayed in that region, or you went to another part of India, or perhaps you didn't, you stayed in this part? We went extensively through Dalton Ganj diocese. They were saying there was one side of the diocese that we hadn't seen, but that was occupied by Maoist rebels, and they weren't sure it was necessarily safe to take us to that part. But all the other areas, we travelled extensively throughout the diocese and got a real sense of the very rural, very basic life that so many of the faithful are living and experiencing out there in India.
Well, I know that you have been studying the situation for persecuted Christians and communities of other faith backgrounds in India for many years with Aid to the Church in Need, not least through the report Persecuted and Forgotten, and through other work that you've done on this topic of India. And I was going to ask you how your theoretical understanding of it, as gleaned through your research, compared with what you saw of the ground reality.
It's a very good question. It's interesting to think that just a couple of months when I'd been there, there'd been a big rally which had been organised for Ranchi in the city itself to protest against individuals retaining scheduled caste status if they were Christians. The argument being that this was brought in for those that adhered to tribal religions. But of course, there is a long tradition of Christianity and Catholicism in the region, and some of the people in the tribal areas, they've been Christian, they've been Catholic for generations. Fortunately, the rally didn't come to much. But it was very interesting knowing that area, that state, Jharkhand state, is thought to be the fourth worst place to be a Christian because of extremism, because of violence. We didn't really see that where we were in Dalton Ganj. We were in rural areas. The people generally had very good relations with their neighbours. They lived a very basic subsistence life. There were a few tales of a few skirmishes with extremists, but generally no problems at all, and the church was going on its everyday business with very few problems from that aspect. So it was eye-opening, but in a very positive way, and also very positive to see these people that had so little, but yet they were still so faithful, and the church meant so much to them.
Yeah, well, that's often our experience on trips of this nature, that we find ourselves being retaught what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a Catholic, by the positive example of the many people we meet along our travels. They are teachers, if you like, of what it means to be faithful to Christ. And one of the things that struck me when we were discussing the outline of your trip was that you penetrated deep into the rural areas. And this is a great privilege in a way, because so often with these trips, you go to the places that are easiest to get to, which are often the towns and the cities, the urban areas. But here you were able to get right into the hinterland. And I wanted to ask what you made of that and what that was all like.
Well, you say able to. It was quite interesting that there was one particular mission station that we went to, a very remote chapel. And to get there, we went onto sort of rural roads. At one point, there was no bridge. So we had to go down the bank of the river. The river was dry, fortunately, across the riverbank.
I hope you knew that before you actually ventured into that.
No one told us any of this. So we went across the riverbed, up the other bank, and back onto the road. But that didn't end our journey's interesting progress. At one point we were driving across fields basically to get to where we had to go, and we ended up going up some very steep, very mountainous roads to get to this one chapel. But one of the ways that they express their faith is through the very warm welcome that they give us. Yes, there is a very interesting tradition of welcome in India. But what was interesting was the way that they brought out the very Christian elements. So you would arrive, again, they would present you with these garlands around your neck, as the bishop had done when he met us at the airport. Then they would take you into the church. And the first thing they did when we reached this mission station, as they'd done at a number of other chapels, was they washed our feet.
Wow.
They repeated an action of our Lord in the gospel before our Last Supper. So a very Christian action, but also something that's very rooted in the Indian tradition of welcome. Hands are washed as well, feet are washed. It's very humbling to be sitting there in a chair when everyone else is sitting on the floor in the chapel. And there's you, there's the bishop, there's another friend from Aid to the Church in Need. And they are literally on their hands and knees washing your feet. Humbling. Humbling is the only word I can think of to describe it.
Well, I have to say, I've never had that on my trips with Aid to the Church. Need to have somebody wash my feet. So that must have been a very unique experience and tells us a lot about the character and the ethos of those who you encountered on that trip. Of course, you've alluded to it a little earlier, but we thought we'd probe a little bit into this some more. You say, and you describe your experiences in the Northeast. You also have been looking quite carefully at the question of Manipur, which is in another part of that region. I know it was nowhere near where you went exactly, but perhaps you could tell people a little bit about what's been going on in Manipur and why we as a charity and as people interested in the whole question of human rights, religious freedom in India should be interested in what's been going on there.
Well, you say it's nowhere near it. You're quite right. It is a very long way away from where I was, but equally, it's also part of the northeast of India. So geographically, I think quite a similar region, although we may get now a flood of emails from people that know better than I do saying actually Manipur is nothing like Jharkhand. But yes, the understanding we have from the church partners that we know over in Manipur is that the reality on the ground does seem to be parallel to the sorts of things that you read about it, that the extremism has indeed taken on a very visceral, a very violent edge. We saw this last year when there were the protests being organised by the Kuki tribe, which very quickly denigrated into clashes between them and the other tribe. And what's interesting is that these clashes were very quickly used as a cover for extremists to attack churches. Something like 150 churches attacked in just the first couple of days. And so local ethnic and other difficulties were exploited. They were exploited by extremists to attack the Christian community and to destabilise them. Fortunately, what we saw in Manipur was quite unique. We haven't seen that repeated anywhere else in the country. But there continue to be problems. There continue to be individuals in displacement camps. But the good news is that the church has stepped in, that it has been providing help, trauma counselling, and food for mothers and children, and some basic medical aid as well, where it's been able to. just to make people's lives better. But everywhere in northeast India, the church does seem to be able to help on a very practical, a very basic level when it sees the needs of the people, whatever those needs are.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me a little bit about when I was in India in 2008, where there had been these attacks in Kandhamal, in what is now Odisha.
I remember them, yes.
And at that point, there had been what was later described as a pogrom against the Christian community in this very rural, completely out of the way region called Kandhamal, and coming face to face with people who had suffered terribly as a result of wanton aggression, and seeing churches and settlements that have been torched. It brought home to you just how random some of these attacks can seem to be, and yet clearly very well orchestrated.
Oh yes,
and they know exactly what they're doing.
Oh yes, it's a very similar situation in Manipur. What appears to be just random acts of violence. The fact that you've got more than 100 churches attacked within the first couple of days, that takes some organising.
Yeah. So the sense that it's suddenly, a knee-jerk response to something of a communal nature within a particular region, it doesn't wash. When you actually look at the detail, it becomes clear that this is a premeditated attack.
Yes, and Bishop Dominic of Imphal up in Manipur State has said as much, and I think he's on the money. Yes.
Yeah. But while there are some very serious and challenging problems, which you, of course, have been looking at very carefully, and which were no doubt in the forefront of your mind as you travelled round in that particular diocese, I'm mindful that you did go to a pastoral centre in Daltonganj, where I gather there's an unusual story that is worth relaying.
I actually stayed at the pastoral centre in Daltonganj.
Right.
And yes, it does have a very interesting story behind it. The original buildings in the pastoral centre compound, one of them had an asbestos roof that had to be replaced. It was no longer fit to be used. But the other building, much worse case and much more horrific story, it was actually infested with termites. It was a mud construction, mud brick construction, and termites managed to eat their way into the building. That then became the holes that they made then became the dwelling place of snakes and other dangerous creatures.
Wow!
So you had a pastoral centre that really wasn't fit for use, and so the diocese decided it needed a new pastoral centre. They started building it. They actually hit a problem with COVID.
Oh,
because during COVID they had to stop building. They found that many of the materials they had were no longer fit for using 18 months onwards, or however long that they had to pause for. And there was huge inflation in the region because of COVID, which meant that supplies were so much more expensive. Aid to the Church in Need, who had been helping the diocese a number of ways before, was delighted to step in to help them complete the project so they could have this new pastoral centre. And I actually stayed in the new pastoral centre while I was there. And also the other building with the asbestos roof, Bishop Theodore had got rid of the roof and actually built an additional storey on it and created a new hall. So the whole pastoral centre complex was it was up and running, and it was amazing to see what we could achieve with help from Aid to the Church in Need. But lest it seem that this isn't related to these remote villages and churches that I've been speaking about, when we were at this chapel that I've described as having to take this marvellous journey to get to and having our feet washed, the gentleman that we met there who introduced us and gave us a bit of a welcome and spoke and told the people who we were, he was the catechist. And in many of these villages, they won't see a priest every week. They'll see him every couple of weeks, possibly every month. And it's the catechist who holds the church together there, who runs services on a Sunday. Mm-hmm. And one of the vital tasks that they wanted the pastoral centre for was training catechists, for refresher retreats for catechists. And so they really can bring them together from all across the diocese into one place and ensure that the teaching and the support that they're giving those local communities is authentically Catholic and something that's going to nurture their faith life.
Well, that's really, really important that the laity are being empowered to be able to reach out. And we know that in many of the countries, I was thinking as you spoke there of Pakistan, and recognizing that, of course, in that country too, there's a very sophisticated network of catechists who undergo quite a long training program, which enables them to really be the church and to become a focal point for so much of the life of the church within their local communities. And if you consider the oppression, the extreme poverty, and other challenges they face, you begin to realize just what an achievement it is to have such a sophisticated and developed program of catechists.
Might I just turn the tables on you for 5 seconds here? Because you've asked me about Manipur. Of course, there's been similar problems in Pakistan, and it might be of interest for the listeners and the viewers just to hear a bit about some of the issues that they've been facing, which of course is something you've very much had your finger on the pulse of.
Yeah, well, I mean, we at Aid to the Church in Need have been following very closely 3 areas of concern. The first concerns blasphemy allegations, whereby the mob take matters into their own hands and essentially accuse of innocent people of having committed blasphemy and then turn on them and committing terrible atrocities, lynching people. And we've been looking very much at a number of cases, mostly notably a grandfather, a man in his 70s, who was lynched and then subsequently died. And his name was Nazir Gil Massi. And his death at the age of, in his early 70s, sent shockwaves because it was clearly a set-up job. He died a martyr, really. And so we have problems with the blasphemy law and the way in which it is abused and people making up cases. And secondly, we've been looking at the issue of forced conversion and forced marriage of Christian and other minority faith girls and young women, which is now an endemic problem across the Punjab and Sindh provinces, and indeed, no doubt, beyond. And a general sense in which if you're a minority faith girl, particularly Christian, in the Punjab, you're fair game to be just picked off the street, forcibly converted, forced to deny your faith, and forced into marriage with someone much older. So there's that problem. And then the final area of concern is slavery, bonded labour, brick kilns, sweepers, people working down sewers, who have terrible working conditions, who often are in debt, and whose family, again, are abused sexually as well as physically in other ways. And we at Aid to the Church in Need are working very hard to highlight these problems and to provide relief. And it's important for everyone to be aware that these challenges exist, and that it is key to the work of Aid to the Church in Need and everything we stand for to be a voice for those who are denied a voice. But just a final question, if I may, turning back to India. Despite everything, there's a great deal of hope, isn't there, from what you say?
Oh, good grief, yes. You know, the warm welcome that we were given at those chapels, the enthusiastic singing of chants in the local language, the pride that they take in the celebration of the liturgy. There is just so much that they can teach us, and so much that you can see in the church in rural India, which is an inspiration and a testimony to us here. So yes, there are problems in India, but let's never forget that the faith still burns brightly in those far-flung rural areas.
Well, on that positive note, thank you so much for joining us for the Break the Silence podcast today. I'm John Pontifex, and with me today has been John Newton. Thank you so much.